Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome all of you to the Fall 2014 Mansfield Conference. My name is Abraham Kim. I'm the director for the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center here at the University of Montana. Each year, the Mansfield Center organizes with partners across our state and the U.S. a major conference to examine critical policy issues that are debated across our country, shape our national psyche, and often impacts our relationship with important allies and countries in regions such as Asia Pacific. Honoring the life work of the late Senator Mike Mansfield as a thought leader and as a celebrated statesman, this is a 30-year tradition of bringing leading opinion leaders, scholars, and thinkers to Montana to engage our community in important national and international discourse. Most recently, this forum examined issues such as global human trafficking last spring, and last year, the debate about health care in our country. The next few days, we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, the wilderness and public lands. I don't know very many issues closer to the heart of Montana as these. As we did in our previous conferences, we are confident that as we spotlight the Wilderness Act, its history, and its future, that we will have an enriching, lively, and stimulating discussion and exchange. As many conferences, there are many people involved and many people who pulled many hours and many overnight burning the midnight oil trying to pull something like this together. And we have many people to thank. But in particular, we would like to highlight a few people we would like to thank. First of all, Congressman Pat Williams for his efforts and his leadership. Professor Rob Saldin, Professor of Political Science, Mr. Zach Porter, and Professor Dane Scott. We have many other people in the planning committee, such as Celeste Bickford, who is actually responsible for the beautiful gallery you see behind you, and other people like Connie Myers and Natalie Dawson, and our staff, Mickey Hellman and Caitlin Sager. And in addition to individuals, we have many organizations that have come together to support these next few days. And many of the sponsors, well, actually all the sponsors are listed here on the left. But in particular, we would like to highlight the Montana Wilderness Association, the Business for Montana's Outdoors, and the Project for American Democracy and Citizenship, as well as the University of Montana and the President's Excellence Fund. We thank you again for coming this evening and joining us as we kick off the next few days of important discussions about the Wilderness Act. And now I'd like to introduce to you Professor Dane Scott, the Director of Ethics and Public Affairs Programs at the Mansfield Center, to introduce to you our speakers this evening. Thank you very much.
Well, this part of the program is the storied past, and we don't get to the troubled future until Friday, so I think we're in for a treat. And with the Wilderness Act being 50 years old, we have some folks up here who know something about the storied past, and have participated in it, and have studied it, and made it. And so I think this is really an exciting time, and I think many of you here, I can tell, are here tonight because you know some of these folks, and you know they have some good stories to tell. But some of you might not, so I'm going to do a quick introduction. I asked them to send me short bios. And so we'll start over here with Smoke Elser, right in the middle. And Smoke has spent 45 years as a wilderness outfitter in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, and has spent more than 50 years as an instructor, sharing his passion for wilderness and wilderness ethics in packing, horsemanship, and minimum impact camping through Leave No Trace standards. Smoke prides himself on its success in exposing both locals, visitors to all the beauty that Montana has to offer, with a special affinity for the majestic Bob Marshall Wilderness. And I know Holmes Ralston, whose philosophy has influenced a lot of us, has gone on some of these trips with Smoke. So maybe that's where Holmes's philosophy comes from, and we'll get some insights. Bill Cunningham is next to Smoke, and Bill's life is centered on wilderness as a field studies teacher, writer, photographer, outfitter, and longtime wilderness activist. He has a special connection to UM, having earned a bachelor and master's degree in forestry there during the 1960s, followed by an extensive career as an instructor in the School of Forestry. After nearly 40 years of guiding backpacking trips from Alaska to New Mexico, Bob is one of the few Montanans, and I think this is very impressive, to have hiked in every inventoried federal roadless acre in Montana. I think that's an achievement. Pat Williams, one of our co-organizers that we worked with to put this together. Pat represented Montana in Congress for 9 terms, more consecutive terms in the U.S. House than anyone in Montana's history. Pat sponsored successful legislation designating both the Lee Metcalf Wilderness Area, which is presented back here, and the Rattlesnake Wilderness Area north of Missoula, Montana. He led the successful legislative efforts to save the Bob Marshall Wilderness from oil and gas exploration and help ban geothermal energy drilling near the borders of Yellowstone National Park. And I've heard some of these stories working with Pat, and I think you're in for a treat. And then finally, Perry Brown. Perry Brown is my boss. He is the provost and vice president for academic affairs at the University of Montana, formerly dean, so he's been my boss twice, and a great boss, I might say. Formerly dean of UM's College of Forestry and Conservation, his expertise in natural resources, social science, policy and planning, recreation behavior, and wilderness studies. Dr. Brown remains active in the field of mentoring graduate students and helping develop academic capacity in protecting area management in various southern African countries. And Sally Mauk is going to be our moderator, which is an extreme treat. Life almost doesn't go on without, something seems wrong that Sally retired from NPR, and I think many of you feel that way. I couldn't believe it. Sally is a Kansas native, University of Kansas grad, a double major in German language and literature, Western European history. She says, "Go Jayhawks," and I think Donald Worcester, who will be talking tomorrow, will agree. And Sally spent 30-plus years as news director at Montana Public Radio. And most important for tonight, she was a former wilderness ranger in the Cabinet Mountains wilderness of the Kootenai National Forest. So please welcome, and I hope you're in for some good stories tonight. So please welcome our
Well, I can't imagine that in my career I've moderated a more distinguished panel than this panel. I know some of these guys for a long, long time, and someone suggested I should introduce it as the geezer panel. I was going to introduce it as the old farts panel, actually, but moderator included. But we do have a lot of ground to cover with our panelists tonight, but I've asked each one of them to start by telling their personal story of their first experience with wilderness and how that may have set them on a path of being advocates for wilderness. And Pat, I'm curious about your first experience.
Okay. I'm going to say, just as a housekeeping thing, I'm a little worried about people sitting in these 3 rows because they're looking at a maroon tablecloth and what do you think? Can we do anything about that? You know, they'll want their money back.
Can we slide the podium?
sorry to disrupt your... That's better for you, right? I still worry about that sort of thing, even though you can't vote for me anymore. My first occasion into wilderness was into the Anaconda Pintlers. And it was startling to me. Now, I don't know what effect it had on the rest of my life. I haven't measured it, but I can't identify it. But it startled me, and I want to suggest that it was more startling to me than it was when you had, well, it was more startling as a comparison of other places to me than it probably was to you, because you see, I grew up in Butte. And so the comparison between the Anaconda Pintler outback and wilderness areas and Butte, bless its heart, was extraordinary. And it was the first time, I think it was the first time that I really thought I was smelling pure air and standing knee-deep in pure water. And I suppose that had a lasting effect on my life. By the way, I went directly from the Anaconda Pintlers back home to Butte, gladly. So if there are any Butte people here, we're still hanging tough. I want you to know that, yeah.
Smoke, I'm sure this was a long time ago for you.
Yeah, a long time ago, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately. But at any rate, I started in 1957. I came from Ohio, from the Buckeye State, to Montana to work for the Forest Service, and instead I got in with an outfitter. His name was Tom Edwards. He was quite an outfitter in that area, and from that time on, we spent a lot of time in the wilderness. Almost all of it in the Bob Marshall. However, I've been in the Anaconda Pintler. I've been in the Bitterroot Selway. I've been in the Gila down in New Mexico. I've traveled a lot all over the area. But the wilderness has really made a mark on me, and Tom Edwards, of all people, really made a mark on me. He was my mentor, and I really enjoyed working with him, and he taught me about wilderness. And that was the most important thing that I remember.
And Bill.
Okay, I'm trying to go back into the archives here a little bit, blow off a few cobwebs. The question first experience. I think when I was a little boy, the whole world was wilderness. You know, all you had to do was get outside, and it was wilderness, a place of wonderment. And I remember vividly when I was 5 years old, going fishing with my dad on a place just out of Lolo, Montana, that had been homesteaded by my great-grandparents. And it's up on Mormon Creek. And my dad cut a willow pole, handed it to me, just a willow, tied a string on it, and I caught my first little trout, about 3 inches long. And to me, it was a whale. And I remember that so vividly as my first real sense of connection with the wild. And then when I was 9 years old, we took our first family trip into the Bob. It was only a little ways into it. And that was well before the official 1964 designation of the Bob, but known at that time, of course, as the Bob still. So I guess, yeah, going back a few years, all right, when I was 5 years old.
But you still remember catching that fish, of course. Perry, how about you?
Sure. And like Bill, my story goes back to when I was a kid, because I grew up in the early days in Southern California. We had a family cabin in the Sierras up at Mammoth Lakes. And so from the time that I was 1 year old to quite a bit older than that, we spent a good portion of every summer up at the cabin. And in those days, there wasn't the same dedicated wilderness that we have right now. The Wilderness Act hadn't been passed, but I can remember what now we think of as the John Muir Wilderness, and going back there with my family, going back there sometimes on foot, sometimes on horseback, or dropping down on the North Fork of the San Joaquin and then working your way up into the Minarets or some places like that. And I can remember those as a kid, as that was the place, that was the formative part of it. And the thing that strikes me is two things. One is, in those days, we rarely saw other people when we were back there, so that was pretty cool. And the other thing was that it was absolutely spectacular in terms of the scenery that you had. And so you just felt that you were in heaven when you were there.
You all have been so involved so long on this issue. There was a heyday of wilderness advocacy and wilderness support. Talk about when that was and why that was. And Pat, do you want to start with that?
Well, when the act passed in '64, when it finally passed through the House, and it had most of its difficulty in the House. It wasn't passed quickly and took years. But finally, when it was passed, there was only one dissenting vote in the House. A Texan. Most Texans are smarter than that, but it was a fellow from Texas. I've forgotten his name. That was certainly a heyday. People were understanding of what was happening. If I can say this without being particularly caustic, I want to say that then, once some American extractive corporations began to believe that wilderness was going to cut into their profits, things changed. But from '64 until probably about the mid-'70s, the late '70s, I think there was a wilderness heyday in America.
You agree with that, Smoke?
Yeah, I do. And I started in there in 1957. And I've been in the Bob Marshall, by the way, 57 years now, every year. But, you know, Tom Edwards, one of the things he did, here's a green kid from Ohio, you know, from the Buckeye State, and he grabbed me by the ear and he said, you're going to a hearing in Great Falls, Montana. We're going to go before a guy by the name of Senator Metcalf and Mike Mansfield. And he said, I want you to tell him what you think of wilderness. And that was really the highlight of my life as far as wilderness. Because these gentlemen, at first, of course, I was shaking in my boots to go up before these guys. And when I testified at that time, that meant a whole lot to me. And that's kind of the beginning of the heyday for me. And in '63, I testified, and again in '64 when it was passed. And ever since then, I've tried to live a part of the wilderness. Bill just reminded me, he said, Smoke, you got to remember, he says, pretend you're just sitting in front of a campfire and you hear a wolf howling over here and maybe an elk bugle over here. And he said, it won't be so nervous to you. See, I'm very nervous.
Bill, you've been active so long, and you remember, I'm sure, when it was pretty easy to get people to go to a hearing and easy to get people to speak up for wilderness.
Well, I don't know that I would call it easy. We had to browbeat people into submission to do these things then as we do now. A lot of people don't want to get up in front of in the public. They might write a letter, especially if you write it for them. But as far as standing up and going public, that's never been easy to get folks to do that. And we've used a variety of tricks that I need not go into now. But as far as heyday, I wanted to comment on that, if I may. We're currently in the heyday for wilderness. We've admittedly had sort of at a low point during this amazing heyday period, but think about it this way. Okay, we're celebrating the big 5-0 for the Wilderness Act, and very appropriately so, because it's such a landmark piece of legislation, the envy of the world, quite literally. And so it's tremendously important that we gather as we are now celebrating the 50th anniversary. But 50 years is not very long. It's long in terms of the human lifespan, but it's not very long. And the key point of the Wilderness Act is the concept of enduring protection. That is this amazing contract that each of us is making to future generations to preserve an enduring resource of wilderness. It's an incredible commitment that we're making to those who will follow us. And so the idea of in perpetuity, the idea of forever, the idea of enduring makes the 50 years look like not quite so long a span of time. And Pat is exactly right on the dates. From 64, just looking at Montana's 3% contribution to the nation's wilderness system that we have. 3% of our nation's wilderness system is in Montana. And in 64, we got roughly half of the amount of wilderness we have designated in Montana immediately upon passage of that act, with 5 national forest administrative wilderness areas designated. And then in the 19 years following that, as Pat indicated, from 64 to 83, we roughly doubled our contribution to the wilderness system within Montana. And so now we have 15 areas, federal areas, plus 1 tribal wilderness, making 16 that add up to a little under 3.5 million acres. So you might say, okay, we had the heyday until 83, but we've gone through 31 years without a single acre being designated as wilderness within the state of Montana. So we're not having a heyday right now. But again, looking at it from a longer term perspective, the very fact that there's this many people here tells me that we're still in the heyday and that we are gearing up, and we're going to see a lot of changes in the future. But wilderness is largely a product of the political, or a function of the political process, and which has its ups and downs, and so we're in that down cycle. But I do believe that support for wilderness is gathering and increasing across the country, and certainly within Montana. I see vivid examples of growing support for wilderness within Montana. It's no longer an ugly 4-letter word that politicians in particular are shying away from. So I'm a glass is half full kind of guy with respect to wilderness. We're still in the heyday with much more to come.
Perry, you remember the first heyday, I'm sure.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, I like the optimism that Bill expresses here, though, because I think it's really great to think about what's to come, and we're going to move into another plateau on this whole thing. But certainly one of the first heydays, I mean, there was a lot of work that went up to the passage of the bill itself. But as Pat mentioned, when the bill was passed on September 3rd, 1964, or signed that day, and I think we have a picture up here of it being signed, or was anyway, and that was a part of the heyday. I mean, when you have 373 to 1 in the House, and whatever it was, like 87 to 12 in the Senate, something like that. I think somebody was absent that day. But, I mean, you had almost everybody on board. And those people were still involved about 20 years later. There were many of them still there. And that heyday that we had in that period, anyway, was one of a lot of passage of wilderness bills to expand from the original 9 million acres in the Forest Service, to really go and to bring other agencies into the process. And of course, we had that came along soon after that was some areas that were being looked at in the Bureau of Land Management as they came into the system. And you had the first wildernesses, first even concept of that in Fish and Wildlife Service, and then you had the National Park Service, which had always saved some backcountry, but hadn't called it that. And so that was going on. And one of the things that I remember, which I thought was pretty exhilarating, I was a young assistant professor in these days, but we had the rare activity going on, the roadless area review and analysis. Not successful in what it came up with, but the hearings and things that went on, people were coming one after the next up there to talk about the value of wilderness and how we needed to push, in that case, the Forest Service to go beyond what they were thinking about, add more acreage to it, think about a larger estate than they had been thinking about, and that was exhilarating. We ended up with Rare 1, and then we had Rare 2 stuff because they kept getting better at it as people kept pushing. But that was part of the heyday. As citizens were pushing this agency to really think about wilderness and expansion, a place where the idea had kind of originated a long time ago, but then sort of lost its way in that particular thing and got pushed hard. And they kept expanding their ideas about it. And that was part of the heyday. It was fun. It was really fun. Except for the fist fight in Idaho Falls. The guns were in a couple places and stuff, but they got pulled out when we talked about it. But it was generally fun.
Pat will tell you about Dylan.
Yeah,
Why don't you tell us about Dylan, Pat?
Yeah, we'll leave Dylan alone for a while.
Oh, now we're all peaked. We have
On
to
the
hear
same
this.
lines, though.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Well, during my first term in Congress, I was fortunate to get on the Interior Committee, which is now called Natural Resources, and then from there down to the Public Lands Subcommittee, a member of both. And Rare 2 had come to the Congress, a Forest Service review and evaluation with recommendations for wilderness for each state. So Montana's Rare 2 stuff literally came to me because I was on the committee with jurisdiction. And because I represented Western Montana, and that's where all the wilderness proposals were, all of them. And it was the only raw power I ever felt in 18 years in the Congress was wilderness, really, truly. The Congress listens to the member from that area. So I decided I'll do this quickly, I decided to have a hearing in Dillon. And I went up to the chairman of the committee boldly and said, I went up to Morris Udall, if you remember Morris Udall. He and Jimmy Carter ran against each other in the Democratic primary. And Carter obviously won that primary, but Mo Udall was as famous in those days as, John McCain is now, who lost his race. And so I asked the chairman, knowing he'd say no if he'd come to Montana. And he said, absolutely. And then he told me why. He told me how important Montana was in the whole wilderness effort. So I had chosen Dillon. We got a commercial plane to Billings, and then a twin engine to Dillon. And Udall was always the nicest guy in town. It didn't make any difference what town he was in. He was the nicest guy there, I assure you. So he walked onto the plane, and the cockpit curtain was closed, and he threw it open. He said, hiya, fellas, big long arm. Mo was a former pro basketball player. He was 6'6" or 7, I think. And hiya, fellas, I'm Mo Udall. Well, they were pretty excited. They really were. And they turned around and talked to him, and then he went on and on with them, and he was telling stories and going on. And I happened to know, as the pilots obviously did, that a big storm was coming into Dillon, so they got very nervous. You could see them tapping the instruments and trying to get going. And it was a twin-engine plane, I think a BLM plane. And Mo said, this is actually better than the Dillon story. Mo said to them, fellas, the conversation died down, and so Mo didn't want to leave, so he said, fellas, I'm a single-engine pilot myself. And the pilot turned around to him and said, is that right, Congressman? Well, that's just terrific. Now, I'll tell you what. You go back there and strap yourself in, and if we lose one of these engines, we'll call you. We got to Dillon, and there was a riot. It was an anti-wilderness riot in Dillon, and it was serious. And it involved guns loaded and knives and people screaming at us on the street. And I won't go into the rest of it. I can later if it arises, but Mo Udall said to his constituents when he got back home, he said, well, I've just been up in Montana. He said, they have this funny way of saying hello to you up there. Well, what's that, Mo? And he said, well, when we wave at somebody, we use all 5 fingers. Down here.
Bill, talk about, in terms of the heyday still, just going to places and having people be so passionate on both sides, like Pat was just saying. People were riled up and still are about wilderness and how that affected what did and didn't happen. Those passions were so crucial and still are.
Yeah, passion is absolutely what fuels wilderness advocacy and what has resulted in every single designation of wilderness. People who care. I've often said the people lead, Congress follows, but the people lead. Now, once in a while we get a rare congressman like Pat who does both. He's out there leading, providing critical leadership, as he did, and a good example being the rattlesnake right here. But I know Pat would be the first to say that the groundwork for the rattlesnake, and I'm using that as an example because it's right on our back doorstep here in Missoula, the rattlesnake wilderness and NRA, designated in 1980. Pat Williams carried the bill and did more than carry it. He made it happen. He got it through the legislative process. But the foundation for that legislation was laid decades before by passion. It was spearheaded, and I'll just use an example here, it was spearheaded in this community by Cass Chinsky. And without Cass's leadership, it would not have happened. Now, maybe someone else would have filled the vacuum, and the point I'm making is you've got to have a person who is point person, who is spearheading, who is constantly working the process, lubricating the wheels of political change, and exciting people to display the passion that they have in their heart for the wild country that they care about. And the rattlesnake, a prime example of that. And I could use that example with the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness. It was at least an 11-year process, and there were folks and conservationists supporting wilderness for the Absaroka Beartooth in two basic camps. There was the conservative camp who said, I'll say the more aggressive camp that said, we want a unified Absaroka Beartooth wilderness, despite the fact that the Achilles heel of the Absaroka Beartooth is Slough Creek Corridor, and if we push for too much, and so we're going to push for the unified AB. Others said, no, that'll blow the whole thing up, and let's just go for the Beartooth. That's a sure thing. We know we can get that. And the more passionate within the conservation community, the more passionate voice won out, and we got an Absaroka Beartooth, a unified Absaroka Beartooth wilderness as a result of pure citizen passion displayed aggressively over an 11-year period, with the Great Bear sandwiched between the Bob and Glacier Park, which was near and dear to the heart of Senator Lee Metcalf. That was a 25-year campaign that was initiated initially by Cliff Merritt, John Craighead, and Dallas Eklund during an epic float trip down the Middle Fork of the Flathead. And from that, 25 years later, people like Chris Roholt and others that are here worked passionately and doggedly and untiringly to make that happen. And it was Brock Evans who said that the formula for wilderness conservation is endless pressure, endlessly applied. And that's as true today, if not more true, than it was then. And so rekindling that passion is what's going to continue to fulfill the wilderness, Montana's contribution to the wilderness system, which is far from complete. The potential is out there, significant potential on both National Forest, BLM, and of course Glacier Park and the northern rim of Yellowstone, eminently qualified for wilderness, aren't even on the drawing boards right now. We're preoccupied by National Forest and BLM.
Bill, I'd like to say that you have described exactly what I found out about Montanans and their support or opposition to wilderness during my years in the Congress. Americans and Montanans are for or against lots of different things. You're for a tax cut for corporations or the wealthy because you believe in certain economic policy, or you're against it. Even with regard to war, You're for what the president might be saying at this hour, or when you find out about it, you might be against it. But when it comes to the land, you're passionate. And you're passionate not only about state land, but about federal land, which belongs to you and everyone else in America. And the people in the West passionately want to keep that land for all the public. They don't want it in the hands of the State Lands Department, which can't afford it to begin with. There is a difference between the issue of tax cuts or even abortion and land. People that are against it are absolutely rib-rocked against wilderness, believing it will shut them out. People that are for it are just as earnest being for it. And for elected officials, for your representatives, yesteryear, today, tomorrow, to deal with this issue, they have to make an early decision, I'm on this side or that side. Because if you try to get in the middle of this issue, you'll have both sides on you, and on you very passionately.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Smoke, you've taken, I don't know, thousands of people, I'm sure, into the Bob, into wilderness, and I'm guessing not all of those people were passionate about wilderness before they went in. Tell me, if you could, some of your experiences taking people into the wilderness for the first time and how that may have changed them.
Yeah, I'll try to. That's true. A lot of the people, a lot of our guests come to the wilderness just to, they wanted to see it, or just to put their foot in it and say that they've been there. So the outfitter's role is, nobody really recognizes the outfitter role in wilderness. It is tremendous in the fact that we have an opportunity to touch people from all over the world and teach them about wilderness. And believe it or not, it's a little hard to teach somebody about wilderness. I've had executives from big companies such as a Boeing aircraft company. I had Bill running around smelling the ponderosa pine. Does everybody know that a ponderosa pine, if you smell the bark, it smells like vanilla? Mm-hmm. Here I've got a man that built the 747, and he's running around smelling the bark. So I touched him in a certain way so that he understood wilderness in a way that no one else can. And it isn't just the executives. You know, I've handled shoe salesmen, plumbers, electricians, as well as high executives, including a couple of congressmen, to where we had an opportunity of 7 or 8 days to teach them about wilderness. And boy, you have to put your best foot forward and really teach them about wilderness. Sure, the wilderness really helped me a lot because that beautiful scenery you can't hardly miss. But on the other hand, you have to get into the politics and teach them how to understand the politics of wilderness, which these two gentlemen have done real well already. You know, it's hard to grab a hold of an executive that manages 10,000 workers and lead him by the hand into an area that he's not familiar with. So the outfitters really play a pretty important role. Everybody thinks that outfitters are just after the money and let's take them hunting and let's get them a big elk and a big fish and all that. That isn't true at all. I have many of my guides are here. I see Mike and my own daughter, Tammy's out here in the audience. I'm sure there's several other guides that have worked for me. And these people help me teach people how to understand wilderness, and then they go back and maybe make some difference in the legislature. They're the ones that the Great Bear would have not happened at all if it wouldn't have been for a fellow that I had in the hills, because he stopped at the first telephone out of the middle fork of the Flathead and called his reporter, Dale Burke, and he said, I want you to come up here and do an article on the Great Bear. They're going to put roads all through this country. And Dale did that, and about 2 years later we had the Great Bear, along with Lauren Kreck and a lot of the other guys that helped. But it was only because we were able to take these people in there and actually get their feet wet in wilderness. Let them understand what wilderness really is. And that's what really drove things home.
Perry, Smoke is talking about educating people about wilderness, and that's an ongoing thing. We were speaking earlier that there are still so many misunderstandings about, even in Montana, among Montanans, about what wilderness is or is not, and that's an ongoing issue.
Oh, most certainly, Sally. I mean, even with the students that we have that come in, and probably the ones that are here tonight, are passionate about it already and know what we're talking about and things like that. But there's a vast number of them that don't have a concept. And all the time I was teaching natural resource policy in several different universities, wilderness was part of the feature that we had in there so that they could understand how that fit with the other pieces of land use and really try to get a sense for what this might mean and how passionate people were about this and why this is an important component of the whole mix of land uses that we have in the United States. And you know, some people would catch on right away and they could start asking you the great questions and really feed it back, and others you go over it and they're just wondering about this. And it's like Smoke's saying, you know, you've got to find the thing that's going to touch their life so that they can get into it. But that's something we've been doing for years, and we will continue to do that for years as people learn a little bit about it. But there's some really interesting things within the wilderness when a person gets the idea that hey, this is a place where management is not the big issue, where the natural processes you're trying to allow to work as best they can in this place. And when they start getting that understanding, they say, well, yeah, that at least is a counterpoint to these other places, and so now I can understand more of the mosaic that we have out here. And you start getting people to try to understand that. And I think that's been a challenge that we've had for a long time, but it's been really fun, too, because you also get to take these field trips with them so that they can experience exactly what Smoke said, or in some ways, in teaching this, you end up talking about people that for some other reason or maybe an icon for them, but they didn't realize that they were part of the wilderness picture as well. And so, you know, a lot of people will say, talk about wildlife and talk about Aldo Leopold and go on and on and on. Well, when he was the assistant regional forester down in Albuquerque, who's out there surveying the land to figure out how many tracts of land in the western United States are unroaded and greater than 500,000 acres? It's Aldo Leopold. That's the guy who was doing it. And so you take a student that has an image of Aldo Leopold in another realm and start introducing that, and all of a sudden they got the wilderness ideal. And so you work on these kinds of things, but it's really quite fun to do that. And I know there's some of my colleagues in the audience that have had these experiences with students before as well.
Mm-hmm. Bill, what about the notion that wilderness is elitist? That it grew out of the 60s and, that it's only for young, fit people who want to hang out and meditate in the woods?
Well, that's right. You know, the impoverished people might have their ATVs and their snowmobiles and so on, but clearly only the rich can afford a pair of waffle stompers. Yeah, we hear that. I remember when Bob Marshall was presented with that kind of an issue, something to the effect that someone said, well, how much wilderness do we need? And he said, well, how many Brahms symphonies do we need? And really, wilderness goes, the value of wilderness goes so far beyond whatever we humans can make of it. I think that's the first ethical point that we have to establish, that wilderness is for its own sake. And so I think the hallmark of wilderness from a human perspective is that we as a society are showing extraordinary humility and extraordinary restraint. We clearly have the technological ability to unwilderness every square inch on the planet, but to restrain ourselves purposefully as a society, I think is an incredibly profound act of both restraint and humility. And so we can exercise restraint and humility on the individual level, as we do when we go into a place that we truly respect and revere and take care of and practice personal stewardship. And we do that as a society with each designation of wilderness. So if we let ourselves get into this trap of trying to get out of the elitist argument, what we're doing is we're just sort of amplifying the whole human orientation. But in fact, the human orientation is not nearly as important as allowing free-willed land, untrammeled, free-willed land to go through its own natural processes, whether that be wildfire or whatever. Again, we're not very good at doing that, but we're learning, and the Wilderness Act and the designations which represent an implementation of the Wilderness Act can teach us that. I, like Mauk, have done some guiding, not nearly as much as him, but over a period of years, I've also taken folks into the wilderness. And despite that, despite making part of my livelihood from guiding folks in wilderness, I've always felt that recreation is the least important use of wilderness. It's the least important reason to have wilderness. It's the one that resonates with folks because we all enjoy getting out and hiking and backpacking and taking horse trips and hunting trips, fishing trips, and so on. But that's not really the fundamental reason why we designate wilderness. It's the fuel that allows us to designate the wilderness. In other words, you have to have a constituency. And when Mauk takes folks out into the wilderness who have influence politically and who in turn project that influence in a beneficial way to help save wilderness, that's fantastic. And thank goodness that that's occurred and has occurred numerous times with your influence, Mauk, and we're grateful for that. But again, the whole elitist thing, I mean, we could certainly argue that people that buy these expensive toys outside of wilderness are the elitists as well. I think it's a meaningless argument because, again, wilderness is for its own sake, and if we have the wisdom to set these places aside so that natural processes, not human-controlled processes, can predominate, then we can't designate too much of it. In fact, we're already, if we took every federal acre that still retains the qualifications for wilderness, and that's still a sizable estate, probably roughly 200 million acres nationwide, including Alaska, as compared to the 109, is it, that's, I think, in the wilderness system now, 109.5 million acres currently in the wilderness system. So if we tripled that acreage, thereby putting every qualified federal acre in the wilderness system, it would still not represent any sort of balance between wilderness and non-wilderness. So we're past the point of trying to obtain balance. That's not possible.
What he's saying, though, Pat, is a tough sell to politicians.
Yeah. The elitist argument came perhaps naturally because, let's face it, history demonstrates that the earliest wilderness advocates, the wilderness we know now, were rich Easterners. Almost all of them that really had real influence. They're all pretty wealthy. Bob Marshall was wealthy. And there's nothing against that, but it led to this elite challenge. There certainly is a lot more logic on the other side now. And when I was teaching full-time here at Perry, I used to sprinkle my lectures with stories because I always thought stories, for some reason, stuck to the ribs of students. They remember them later, and they have a teaching value to them. So if I may go to a story here, when I got elected, I got a lot of help from friends around, but particularly in Butte in '78. And occasionally I'd go into a joint over there known as the Met Taverns across the street from the Civic Center on Harrison Avenue, if you know where that is. And after I'd been in the office for 2 years and starting to move on the Rattlesnake Wilderness and some other things and had this very difficult hearing down in Dillon, my brother-in-law called me, Carol's brother. And he was a guy who'd go into the Met once in a while. I had a lot of friends in there. Bobby operated a hydraulic shovel in the Berkeley pit. And he called me back in D.C. and said, Pat, you got some trouble out here. I said, what is it? And he said, well, the guys in the Met have been on your case. I said, geez, we elect that brother-in-law of yours. We think he's a Butte guy, and he's going to, create more jobs and all that stuff. And there he's putting wilderness in. What the hell is it? What's he doing, Bobby? So Bobby called me and let me know that. And then about maybe 6 or 8, 10 weeks, more than that, maybe 3 months, 4 months later, he called me and said, don't worry about the guys in the Met anymore. And I said, why not? And he said, well, Ed spoke. I said, what? He said, you remember Ed, the guy that comes in the Met, the guy with the dirty straw hat, wears it winter and summer, and they bring him a shot and a beer and he doesn't say anything and he leaves without saying anything? I said, yeah. He said, well, last Wednesday night, Ed spoke. What did he say? Well, he said the guys were ragging on you down the end of the bar in a pretty loud way, and he said, and I can't repeat here exactly what Ed said, but he said, shut up. And he said, we all shut up. We didn't know Ed had a larynx. And he said, listen, you guys, I'm tired of hearing you talk about Williams and this wilderness stuff he's doing. I've been coming in here for 16 years, every Wednesday night. I have 2 shots and 1 beer and I leave. And I don't say much, but I listen. And you know what you guys talk about in here? You don't talk about how much you like working for the Anaconda Company. I've never heard you say a good word about the company or the Berkeley Pit or any of these mines. But you do talk about fishing on the Big Hole. You do talk about getting your elk and that habitat has to stay clean. Pat Williams and the other people like him are doing the only thing you give a good goddamn about. Now shut up. Don't worry about the Met anymore, Pat.
Very good.
Smoke, I'd like to follow up what Bill was saying, though, about recreation not being the centerpiece value of wilderness. And I saw you nodding your head, agreeing with him about that.
Yeah, that's true. I think, sure, people come to get big elk and big fish, but they also come for one other thing, and that's for the hush of the land. Mm-hmm. They come to gain their own reality. The wilderness is one of those few places that you can go where nobody else, they aren't going to influence you. Only your own thoughts are going to influence you. And I think for that reason, the wilderness is really of great value for that. At the beginning of each one of our trips, especially here in the last few years, what we've done is I've got a little box that it has a lock on it. And as soon as they come in, I ask everybody to get out their cell phones and drop them in the box, and all their electronic communication and all their games that they can play. They can play 1 million games now. And I ask them to do that because I want them to actually feel the wilderness. And then I take that box and I put it in the car and lock it up, and there it is. It stays there until 8 days later we come out at the end of the road. And I've had lots of those people come out and say, gee, maybe I didn't need that cell phone. Maybe I didn't need that computer tablet that I was going to carry with me and do a little work in there somewhere. Maybe I got more work done just by letting my mind slow up to 3 miles an hour and enjoy the backcountry.
All right.
Perry, it has been 31 years since any wilderness has been designated. In 1988...
In Montana?
In Montana.
Okay.
In 1988, it came very close, but it didn't happen.
No, it didn't, and I think Pat knows that story really well, and I don't know that one all that well. I mean, I know about it, but it certainly is a case that it ended up in the only time that a president has vetoed a wilderness bill. The only time that has happened. And that was a real blow. And of course, it was a tremendous political struggle that was going on at that particular time. But Pat probably knows this story very well. I wanted to just comment a little bit on what these two gentlemen just talked about, though, in terms of recreation and other use of that. There's another group of people that I know that many of them have found the wilderness just a great place for them to watch processes and understand, and that's ecologists. I know a number of ecologists that have worked in wilderness areas simply because it's an environment that we are not tampering with to the extent we are of others. And so they can watch things develop and change and see how they function. And I think that's been a great value to the wilderness. It's not one that resonates big time with the publics out there, but it's a value that we've got, a part of this mosaic of landscapes that we have. But maybe Pat wants to address a little bit about what happened in '88. He was there.
Yeah, it was my bill that got axed by Ronald Reagan, a guy I liked, but who had really bad policies, particularly with regard to the environment. He was completely and entirely on the other side. Long story short, we got a bill passed. I started putting in bills in when I first term, and then a lot more as things went along. They'd usually get hung up in the Senate. The one thing senators seem to dislike is having to vote, and they don't like roll calls, and they don't like people who call for a roll call from the other senators. So I'd get a bill through the House, and it wouldn't get to the Senate. And then finally, in 87 or 8, we get a bill through the House and over to the Senate, and John Melcher and Max Baucus and I put our shoulder to the wheel and started moving it along. We got it through the Senate. It was a little different in the House. We got it through a conference committee, and we got it down to President Reagan's desk just before the House and Senate adjourned for that year. I was here in Missoula, and I was going to I forget if it was a Rotary or a Kiwanis meeting, early in the morning, one of those sunrise meetings and breakfasts. And my telephone rang. I was staying in a motel out on Broadway Street just as it turns to go toward the airport. And the phone rang, and it was my natural resource guy in Washington, a fellow that some of you know, Art Noonan. And Art said, "Pat, have you seen the news?" And I said, "No, what?" He said, "President Reagan vetoed your bill." And I said to him, "Art, I'm in a hurry. I got to get to this meeting. What are you calling about?" He said, "No, that's what I'm calling about." I thought he was kidding me because he was kind of a practical joker. Reagan had vetoed the bill, the only wilderness bill in history ever vetoed. And it was the most obscene political veto in environmental history. And just a few days after he vetoed it, he came on the air in Montana. And nobody could come on the air anywhere, but particularly in Montana, and catch as much attention and respect as Ronald Reagan. And he said in that "oh shucks" voice he talked about how he vetoed this bill. And he vetoed this bill because it was done in the dead of night. Montanans didn't know this was coming. Now, we'd had a whole decade of hearings and bills and hearings on this bill out here and the rest of it. But you know who he was talking to? People that watch TV but don't pay attention to politics. They didn't know the bill was coming. He was their secret weapon everywhere, on every issue. So he said to them, "You didn't know, my Montana friends, that this bill was coming. It came in the dead of night. And you don't know what's in it." Well, hell no, they didn't know what was exactly what was in it. Even people paying attention, except for folks like Bill and us, they didn't know what was in it. Of course not. That's how a republic works. You hire people to know what's in it for you. You should pay more attention yourselves, but that's the way it is. And so he said, "But we can make sure that something like this never happens again. That another president or this president never has to veto another Montana wilderness bill. And the way you can do that, my friends, is when you vote 2 weeks from now, on the second Tuesday in November, you vote for my close friend Conrad Burns.
Yeah.
He'll see that it never happens again. Conrad and John were running against each other. John was ahead in the polls. Reagan was more popular than John, and Melcher went down to defeat, and Conrad Burns went to the Senate. Now, that was not the only reason, but it was the tipping point.
Sally, if I could just make a comment, not about that, but going back to when the Wilderness Act was passed, where we said, 373 to 1, this is a pretty bipartisan bill and things like that. I mean, it's really had that. And you had, over on the Senate side, Clinton Anderson and Frank Church were managing this whole thing on the Senate side, both Democrats. Who managed it on the House side? John Saylor from Pennsylvania, Republican, managing this bill through a difficult place. Pat said it was the most difficult of the two houses to get it through. Yep. And it was being managed by John Saylor from Pennsylvania. And so it was truly a bipartisan picture in those days. 20 some odd years later, that had ceased to exist.
Our old friend Stuart Udall, Mo Udall's brother, who had been a congressman, and then Jack Kennedy appointed him Secretary of Interior. Stu and I were friends, and I'd go down to see him. He's passed away now, bless his heart, but we were good friends. He's considerably older than all of us up here, even back then. And I said to him, "What's the great disappointment of your life, Stuart?" Stu was a Democrat, but moderate. He said that my Republican friends have turned against wilderness. He said, "I don't understand it, but it's powerful, and it bothers me all the time."
Bill, when you were arguing for wilderness back in the day and acreage was being added, the arguments were on the merits of the acreage, whether it was wilderness quality or not. What are the arguments now? Because that's not probably going to sell.
Well, that's what you start with that. In other words, first of all, to be effective, it's got to come from the grassroots. So you've got to have that local constituency, people that know the turf and that care about it, are passionate, as we've talked about before, and have done their homework, know what the arguments are. So you start with federal land that meets the qualifications of wilderness, that is roadless and undeveloped and so on. And we had many of the same constituencies opposed to wilderness then that we have now. What we had then was a much stronger timber interest in Montana than we have today, replaced to some extent today by a stronger, more vocal off-road vehicle interest, motorized recreation constituency. And that has caused some fragmentation. It's caused some consternation, obviously. But the parameters of the argument are basically the same. We've got wild country. What are we going to do with it? Most of it remains in limbo. And the problem with that is the incremental loss of wildland values, as we all know here. The gradual erosion of wilderness quality, just either through lack of any formal protection or just through sitting back and letting an anti-wilderness constituency grow, develop, and become more politically powerful. And so we've seen that phenomenon in some specific areas. But the basic question of, is this qualified for wilderness or not, that's still the starting point. And it's a similar debate, but we don't have Pat Williams and Lee Metcalf in Congress right now. That makes a difference. And I do think we have a growing constituency. I think that there's more people out there that care about these places and that care about them, I guess I should say, to be somewhat fair on both sides, that both sides are growing and showing more interest. And I guess one point I might make about the Wilderness Act, when it passed in '64, we worked hard to get it. It took 8 long years and 66 hearings, or 9 hearings, I should say, and 66 revisions of that act, and finally became law. It's a pretty darn good law. if, ands, and buts in it, certainly exceptions. But basically, I think we're pretty proud of the Wilderness Act. It's truly the gold standard of land protection. But when we got it, we knew that, that it would be a two-edged sword. On one side of the sword, we have the enduring protection of wilderness that only statutory permanence can provide. And the big argument and concern at that time was you can't trust the bureaucrats, because just as they can sign an order setting aside land as wilderness, so too can that same hand strike it and overturn it. So the idea of legislative, statutory, permanent protection was the key attribute of the Wilderness Act that folks were working tirelessly for 8 long, tough years to secure the bipartisan support that Perry has mentioned. But the other edge of that sword is that to do that, you got to pass a law. And nowadays, good luck, right? We have a dysfunctional Congress. But that aside, I think even before the dysfunctionality that we see today, I sometimes cynically say that the purpose of the legislative process is to kill legislation. Because you really do go through lots of hoops and jumps and hurdles to pass something. So it's relatively easy to kill legislation. It's damn tough to pass it, especially good legislation.
That's what the founders had in mind.
That's exactly what they had in mind.
Now, we've overdone it, but that's what they had in mind.
Yeah. Exactly, the checks and balances to put some constraints here. So we have to pass legislation to permanently safeguard wilderness, and it's very difficult to pass legislation, as we've learned in Montana with respect to wilderness since 1983, without one single acre designated, although thanks to Pat, we had a bill on the president's desk in '88. But I don't know. I think we're dealing with the same basic framework. That's relatively unchanged. But what we have is a very different approach to how to get to the field goal than we had back during the period of designation when, in a very brief time, we passed the Rattlesnake Wilderness Bill, the Lee Metcalf Wilderness Bill, the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness Bill, the Great Bear Wilderness Bill, the Endangered American Wilderness Bill that contains Welcome Creek, and the Montana Wilderness Study Act. That legislation was going through during the period from late '77 with Lee Metcalf's Montana Study Act, Wilderness Study Act, all the way through '83 with the designation of the Lee Metcalf. So lots of legislation crammed basically within a 5-year period that we secured. I might also mention in 1976 we obtained 3 wilderness designations in Montana with barely a notice given to it. Does anyone know what those 3 were? There was there was no public outcry. There was certainly no controversy or public debate. We got 3 wildernesses designated in Montana: UL Bend, Medicine Lake, and Red Rocks. All Fish and Wildlife Service wildernesses, all part of an omnibus lands bill that passed back then. So it kind of depends. Wilderness is politics. The Wilderness Act of '64 guaranteed that. It is politics. And there were no political headwinds blowing against that designation, against the designation of those 3 relatively small wildlife refuges scattered across Montana from the Centennial Valley all the way to Medicine Lake. Whereas the political headwind has become formidable today. No question. We're at a standstill with several good possibilities, but nothing immediate that's immediately poised for the president's desk at this point. But that will happen with everyone's help here, that is.
When Bill says the wilderness bill is politics, it is, and in my judgment ought to be. If it's not politics, there's no politics in it, you're out of it. Politics means you're involved. Now, you may not feel very involved, but the system is political. That means you get to vote, you get to write letters, you get to go to hearings, you're in it. And you get in the combat. And that's good. The Congress assured that, purposely assured that, when in 1964, it put a few lines in the Wilderness Act that said, and by the way, only Congress may designate wilderness. No executive orders can designate it. No courts can require it. Your elected representatives in the House and Senate. Right? You can write to the president till you're blue in the face, but you write to your member of Congress, bingo, makes a difference.
And that was partly done by Wayne Aspinall in Colorado, Democrat from the West Slope of Colorado, conservative Democrat, that decided that he really didn't like this. He was stalling it, but part of the compromise was to do this exactly. But once they did that, it was very clear that this is a congressional decision, and that's the way it's going to be. But the bill got passed then. And he allowed it to go and allowed Saylor then to carry it on forward.
You're alluding to the impact, really, that activism in Montana on wilderness, the impact it had nationally. And we haven't talked about that yet, but it was huge, and not just because of the individuals involved, but because of the strategy and how it was applied nationally. Fair to say?
Fair to say, and it's fair to say that there were Montanans that were right at the forefront of making things happen during this period that Bill was talking about. And we could name names and stuff like people that are involved, but you could see Scarlett up here at Lincoln and just pushing and pushing on the scapegoat, along with Cliff Merritt and some other people.
Yeah.
These are people that in Montana, Montanans for a long time, were really important in setting the stage for citizen designation of wilderness areas in the United States. And they were the pioneers.
And it's important to add to that, Perry, that the first citizen-initiated wilderness in the nation took place right here in Montana, 1972, with the designation of the scapegoat. That was the very first citizen-initiated wilderness. It was not the product of an agency process or recommendation.
Donna Metcalf, Lee's dear, wonderful wife, told Carol and I the story after Lee's death. She said, years after, we were talking about the difficult bills and how Lee handled them. You know, I suppose he and B.K. Wheeler were the toughest two guys to ever serve Montana in the Congress. They just were bulldogs. And Lee was being pushed to get more wilderness areas, And she said, I came upstairs. They lived on Capitol Hill. She said, or they had one home there and one out in the Bitterroot. She said, I came upstairs at 3 in the morning. And she said, there's Lee with balls of paper. Some of them hit the wastebasket, some of them were scattered around the office floor, his little house office. And she said he was writing a wilderness bill. Lee was brilliant, and he was a lawyer and a former Supreme Court judge in Montana and legislator. He'd write his own bills. You know, I had to send mine, I'm not a lawyer, I send mine off to the Congressional Research Service, then we'd meet about what I wanted and they'd write the bill. Lee would sit and write his own bill. And she said he's writing a bill on wilderness. She says 3 in the morning. She said his hair's all mussed and he's scratching his head as she walked in the office door, and she said he's looking out the black window at some of the lights outside on Capitol Hill. And said when Lee got deep in thought, he didn't know anybody was around. He just lost himself in the thought. And she said, I startled him a little bit. I said, honey, you know what time it is? No. She says, 3 o'clock in the morning. Oh, yeah. I was just thinking. She said, what were you thinking about? She said, I knew he's writing a wilderness bill. What were you thinking about? He said, I was just thinking, I wish these damn grizzly bears could vote.
You know, this is why we're having this conference in a way. 50 years, yeah, that's something to remember. But you know, all of those people, we're talking about the old guard that passed the Wilderness Act. Today we have a new guard that don't know much about wilderness. You know, all our congressmen and representatives now throughout the country are not wilderness advocates particularly, because we've lost all the old guard. The old guard is all gone. The Lee Metcalfs are all gone. The Mike Mansfields, all of those guys are gone. We've got new people in the office now. That's why we need you, the younger generations, to pick up the torch and carry wilderness to the future. Because these young representatives and senators, they don't know nothing about wilderness, really. And that's why we, as people here, we need to educate those people in what wilderness really is. They need to listen to Bill, and they need to listen to Pat and to Perry and understand more what wilderness really is. And that's why we need to have these kind of conferences where we can bring you people in and you can elect. Because when everybody said, well, you get a vote, you know, the only vote you really get is your representative and your senator. So make sure you know who they are, and what they stand for.
You're here.
Bill.
Well, yeah, let me add to that applause. Thank you, Smoke. Now I lost my train of thought.
It's age, Bill.
But you're going to vote anyway.
Yeah, that's right, exactly right.
Yeah, you guys are all
While
younger
you're
than I am.
thinking of that, Bill, I do have one more question for the panel, and then I think we can open it up for questions from the audience or comments. But
Great.
and this is a vague question, I know, but can you imagine Montana without wilderness? What would we have lost without wilderness? We still would have national forests. We still would have the 2 national parks. But what would we have lost without wilderness? Told you it was vague.
We would, you mean if we didn't have wilderness designation, still had public land in the different
Right.
categories you're
Right.
talking about? Well, we would not have a non-human orientation to management. Everything would be done for some utilization, whether it be recreation development, what Ed Abbey would call industrial tourism, or it would be logging, or it would be wildlife habitat restoration with maybe through logging. There'd be a variety of uses on the forest, but it would be humans first, the natural environment second.
I think we also wouldn't have, and I can't put my finger on it, but I don't think we would have all of the mystique that Montana means to this nation. It's just a different place in people's mind, and I think that's partly because of the wilderness that we have. And they know there's wildness here, the closest place in the lower 48 to have real wild places. And that's a mystery for people. And I think that's important.
And that mystery is, that gives us a place, that would give us a place for the sanity of man. I think the wilderness is what that gives you. That gives you an opportunity, a place where you can actually find your own sanity.
I think that I put this first, although it's not most important. Wilderness is an economic cash register for this state,
It is.
including for
Yes,
people
it
that
is.
never get in the wilderness. It's a first-class cash register.
Yeah.
It's big-time revenue.
Yeah.
The other thing is that if you get in it, its greatest gift is to tell you how small you are and how insufficient you are, and I am. That's its greatest gift. It makes us respectful.
And humble.
And humble. Thank you, Barry.
And I think also I wanted to just touch a little bit on a point made by Perry, because I think one of the reasons we have wilderness formally designated is because of the frontier ethic that has uniquely formed the American character. And, you know, hearkening back to Daniel Boone and the frontiersman, the free trapper, Lewis and Clark, all of this is such an integral part of our character as Americans and part of our national identity. And the idea of sort of clinging on to part of that heritage through wilderness, I think, is one of the important motivations behind having wilderness, having places set aside for posterity that are as free and natural as we humans can allow them to be. And I think that's profoundly important. Also, I know many people feel that during the Cold War, that especially there was an impetus toward preserving wilderness, because if you're worried about getting blown up in a nuclear holocaust of some kind, you can seek refuge and solitude and solace in wilderness. And Americans were beginning to become more interested during this period in going into wilderness areas and just plain getting away from it all, so to speak. Getting away from this looming threat that was over the heads of all of us. And so I think combined with these things, this frontier ethic and the Cold War and growing affluence, so that people after the war coming back home and starting their families, and the economy was growing rapidly, people all of a sudden had the means and the mobility to get out and see these places, experience these places, and that's the connection Smoke was talking about. When, with firsthand experience in these places, they become valuable to you.
Sally, if I may, before we go to questions, I think it might be helpful to spread a couple of facts around about wilderness. When passed in 50 years ago, there were 54 areas, including a number in Montana, declared wilderness, and that was 9 million acres. Today, there are 758 areas, in the beginning now, 54, 758, and that 9 million has grown to a little over 110 million. In Montana, we have 3 million acres of wilderness. Now here's, for those people that hear that, 110 million acres, well, that's an overabundance of wilderness. Well, of that 110 million acres, half of it are in one place, Alaska.
57, yeah.
So in the lower 48, about 2% of the federal land is in the wilderness. In Montana, 3 million acres, half of that's in one place, the Bob Marshall. So we really have not outdone ourselves, either nationally or particularly in Montana, which at one time was in the forefront of leading the wilderness struggles. Now states like New Mexico have more wilderness than Montana. We have a ways to go to protect these lands and assure our future in both America and Montana.
Yeah.
If I could just add to that on one point, getting to this part of the theme of the conference, and that is the troubled future notion. We've doubled the acreage of wilderness in Montana in these last 50 years, formerly protected wilderness, but we've also more than doubled the human population in both the United States and the world. And so there are tremendous challenges. Can we actually save wilderness and manage wilderness in a meaningful way with growing human impacts on our little spaceship that we all co-inhabit? And I mean, that's a profound challenge, but I think one positive point is that with more of us and with an increasingly chaotic, crowded, and confused world that we live in, it seems to me that wilderness can only become all the more valuable. And as it increases in value, and it has to be recognized as such, and that's where education is so critically important, well then I think eventually the political headwinds will begin to shift, and the headwind will blow into the face of those who oppose wilderness. And I see that coming.
He's a glass half full. It's getting kind of late, but we can certainly take some questions and or comments that people, I'm sure the panel would be happy to elaborate. Yeah, go ahead. And we set up a mic so everyone can hear, if you don't mind stepping up there. Yeah, okay.
Hello there. First of all, I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, for all of your efforts. I'm from a big city. I hail from San Francisco. So, you know, my mother could not understand why I'd scratch at the post all day long trying to get outside. I was fortunate enough, though, to be in a crew called the Adventure Crew for a couple of years, and we started traveling, and we traveled to Wyoming, Texas, Nevada, Arizona, Idaho, and it wasn't until I came here that I really discovered this is where I want to be. And I made every effort. It took me a year and a half, and I finally got out here, and I've been loving it every day ever since. It's absolutely amazing what we have here, and I hope people don't take it for granted, because back home in San Francisco, it's the concrete jungle, and it's not as pretty, nor is it as friendly. So I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, for everything you've done for us, and from the bottom of my heart, it really does mean a lot to be able to go out there and experience this and be able to be at one with nature. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Molly Galusha, and I am a very proud and grateful daughter of Hugh Galusha, who testified on the Wilderness Act. And that legacy is very, something I do not take lightly or for granted. And I have been in the Bob, not every year, but a lot. And I am blessed, but I've also seen science change and the approach of how we protect and enhance and ensure that the Bob is going to be there. The science has been as political, and hopefully I would love to hear your opinions, that we are going to be safeguarded, that science is going to keep up with what this gentleman stated articulately, what it means to him, that it's going to be there. And we're going to quit. I mean, fire is the best example of how we have shifted.
Yeah. Who wants to take that? Whether the science has become politicized as well?
Well, the Congress pays, did, I assume it still pays, significant attention to the science of ecology. Believe it or not, the Congress, at least the most thoughtful members, and that's a lot of members, gather around on these issues, and wilderness is the one here, but they gather around, for example, on wilderness issues, and they ask a lot of really important questions. And they measure their vote based on the answers to those questions. And many of those questions have to be answered by scientists. So, Molly, I think science is still being used in a good way by the Congress.
I'm Holmes Ralston from Colorado State, and I thank you, gentlemen, for all you've done for wilderness. You might respond to this. I increasingly hear people say, well, wilderness is a good thing. It's a good thing to go backpacking. It's a good thing to go hunting. But wilderness has nothing to do with the main problems the world faces. It doesn't have anything to do with climate change. It doesn't have anything to do with immigrants coming in from Mexico. It doesn't have anything to do with wars in the Middle East, in Iraq or Iran. So they kind of say wilderness is on the back burner. It's a nice thing, but it's not a high priority item in terms of what we have to put our interest in. Can you sort of respond to that?
Bill.
Who, me?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's you, Bill.
Well, yeah, humankind is beset with all kinds of problems. I think one could make the argument, and if I had 9 more hours, perhaps I could do it, and that is make the argument that it's wilderness that's going to save the world. Because these are the reservoirs of relatively clean water and air These are the gene pools for species that we've not yet exterminated. These are places for refuge where people that might otherwise blow themselves up might think otherwise if they could just somehow be introduced to the peace and tranquility of wild country. There is not going to be enough wilderness to solve all these problems, of course, but to say that we shouldn't preserve what we can because we're more focused on the rest of the problems, I think would be somewhat short-sighted. It's true that wilderness is not a front burner issue in the minds of people that are worried about whether they can put food on the table that night or whether they're going to survive the next car bombing. But on the other hand, it's right up there with the things that are most significant that we as humans are capable of doing. So we have to do what we can.
Yeah. I think we've got time maybe for 2 more questions with you, too.
Mauk, you never told me you were a Buckeye, too.
Yep, I am.
I grew up east of Cleveland, Chardon. Yeah, my question is, like, you always talking about Raw 1 and 2, and some of these non-wilderness areas as wilderness areas. And also you got, like, on the East Coast where you got their own Wilderness Act, and there are some wilderness areas where they're, like, decommissioning roads on the outskirts of the wilderness, and for land restoration and all that. And I was wondering if maybe in the future that some of these reclaimed areas could become wilderness. And for example, I'm talking about in the Frank Church, the Big Creek Trailhead, there's actually an old CCC road going into there.
Yeah, I think some of those areas can be reclaimed. I really do. For instance, Schaefer Meadow, which is an airfield in the Bob Marshall, there's a cat trail. They built that airfield with a Caterpillar. The cat trail still stands there, but it is still wilderness. So I think areas can be rehabilitated. But the most important thing you got to remember is you can't build a new wilderness. The thing you can do is protect what's left. And I think that's the most important thing that you need to concentrate on.
And along with that, the question was just asked, one of the things that we've seen is some places heal faster than others. And so if you go to the Monongahela in West Virginia, there are parts of that have been designated wilderness, but they were cut over and things like that. But that land has healed itself, not with a lot of our help, but it has healed itself. And boy, the experience and what you think of is wilderness there, and now things are functioning more like the wildernesses in the West.
And if I could add also, there isn't a separate eastern wilderness system. There's one national wilderness preservation system. And that was actually a key debate point when the Eastern Wilderness Bill was first being considered by Congress back in, when was that, in the 70s, I guess?
72, something like that?
Yes, and that was it. Some thought that there should be a separate Eastern Wilderness system apart from the National Wilderness System with lower standards that would be more permissive in terms of what had happened in the past. And that was loudly rejected by Congress, recognizing the importance of that in the nation there be one national wilderness preservation system with the same standards that are supposed to be applied uniformly. Now they aren't, but they should be.
Hi, my name is Matthew, and I'm a foreign student from Canada, studying here at the University of Montana. I'm from Calgary, Alberta, which is similar to San Francisco and like many other bigger cities in the United States. It's a very, it's considered to be a concrete jungle, but luckily an hour away we got Banff National Park. We got very beautiful places in Canada as well. I'd never considered myself to be a really big nature guy until I came to Montana, actually a few years ago to Eureka. Up in the Kukanusa area there, and we went on a couple hikes, and I truly did fall in love with this area. And I go running every weekend as much as I can up in the Rattlesnake, a beautiful area. Really love it. My question to you is, how do you gentlemen, because I know Pat Williams, sir, you mentioned that there's people who are for wilderness and are 100% for it or either 100% against it. Now, I mean, in my opinion, I was 100% not necessarily against it, but I never really knew the wilderness. How do you go about influencing those people who are 100% against it? against the wilderness to becoming more so accepting and more so, not so against it, but for it. And people who, you know, with political influence, right? Because I believe that's what it is in regards to, right? In regards to creating wilderness out there, it's all political, right? So how do you influence those people in a positive manner so that they go from being against 100% to for it?
Thanks. We Montanans, you used the term foreign country. We Montanans don't see your home as a foreign country. We think it's the boys across the boundary up here, and we like them.
North pasture.
We like them. It's the North pasture, yeah. I know this young man, and we're glad there's another Canadian that's down in Montana. Thanks for being here. I did, and we mentioned Dillon, and I love Dillon, by the way. It's a great place. I had my troubles down there, but it's a great place. And the Big Hole is wonderful. I wanted to put some of the land down there in wilderness, and Reagan vetoed it, and along with a lot of other land, 1 million acres, 1.2 million acres. But so be it. But there was a rancher, a wonderful guy down there, who was solidly against wilderness. And he came in to see me one day back in D.C., and he was nervously twirling his cowboy hat as he sat there. Older gentleman, really terrific guy, but absolutely against this area that he saw out of his window as wilderness. He didn't want it as wilderness. And he came in, and he didn't have much to say. And then finally he said, "Pat, you fly back and forth a lot, don't you?" I said, "Oh yeah, almost every weekend." He said, "Have you flown over?" And he mentioned a couple of places down in Colorado and Wyoming and the mountains there, and some of Montana and the Appalachians. And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "God, those mountains are beat up, aren't they?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "They get big clear cuts in them." I said, "Well, the big ones aren't legal anymore, but yeah." Said, "Sure is a mess," and he's nervous at the hat. I wish I could twirl a hat the way this guy did, by the way. I said, "You know that West Big Hole mountain range that you look out at, out you and your wife's window?" "Yeah." "This is going to look just like that. It's going to look just like that in 25, 50 years. It's going to be spun out with roads, and there's going to be cuts up there, and you're going to look at them." "Yeah, I'm kind of worried about that." He said, "You know, if you wanted to come down to Dillon and have another hearing, we might be a little more friendly to you." So I think experience changes people's minds. You get them in wilderness. You let them fly over some of those areas that maybe they've never been in a plane before, and they see it. You talk to them, and you talk to them on their terms. And you don't argue with them, you're nice to them, and you try to bring them along. It's surprising how open-minded most people are. I was very surprised by it when I got to Congress. And I found Westerners, I don't kind of like nationalism, you know, but I found regionalism, but I found Westerners and mountain people to be particularly open-minded about something. They stand in their pockets, they lean toward you, particularly in Livingston where the wind blows all the time, but they lean toward you and they listen to you, right? We all kind of do the same thing. And so you can talk to people, you can bring them along, but look, it's a lifetime process. I'm glad you guys are interested in it because it's the next generation's coming along, and Smoke's right. You know, it's all up to you now. Although Smoke and I and Bill and Perry are never going to give up, but it's really up to you now.
So I know Dane wants us to quit, but just let me comment about somebody that did something about taking people into the woods or into the mountains and things like that. And that's our friend Bob Marshall.
Yeah.
He lived in Missoula, Montana, working in Forest Service research here, about 1918 or so. And he and Ehlers Koch, who was a forester here, one of the first foresters in the Forest Service, lived on Beckwith Street over here, 300 and something, Beckwith. Okay, he was living there. The other guy that they played around with, I mean, these were men, but they played around with was our guy that wrote River Run Through It and all these kinds of things. So Norman McLean.
Yeah, Norman McLean.
Okay, and so they would gather at the Koch house. And of course, our friend Bob Marshall, he was out there playing with the kids. And after dinner, when they had those dinners there, he'd put those kids on his back and get as a Pied Piper and take them up Mount Sentinel. And it's just what Pat's saying. He got them out of their yard into the mountains. Maybe it wasn't that far, but he got them out there. He took them up there and he talked about it and shared with them. And those kids, I'm sure, became lovers of the mountains and lovers of that experience he had. So that first-hand experience. Our friend Bob Marshall did that for us too. Wow. And it was just great experience that people had.
Everybody should ask one question of all your representatives and all your senators. You know, you can write letters, you can look them in the eye, shake hands with them and everything else. But everybody needs to ask this question of all your representatives and all your senators. You need to ask them what they think wilderness really is. Once you find that question, get the answer to that question, then you know how to lead your politics.
Bill, did you want to make a final
Yeah,
comment?
I was just going to add a little plug for the Montana Wilderness Association, the oldest statewide wilderness organization in the country, formed way back in '58, 6 years before passage of the Wilderness Act. It began as a hiking club out of Bozeman, Montana, designed just to get folks out doing what we're talking about here. And over time, that evolved into the Wilderness Walks program, which now goes both winter and summer into the fall. And it's an incredible program. MWA spearheads getting maybe, Zach, you could help me, maybe 1,000 or more people a season, something like that, into the wilderness, many of whom it's their first experience. And it's a day hike, sometimes it's an overnight trip. Sometimes it's a ski, or I should say a snowshoeing trip in the wintertime, going into, as much as possible, the unprotected roadless areas, potential wilderness candidates that are out there on the chopping block that we're trying to get people more familiar with, and hopefully they'll pick up the sword of advocacy and help defend these places and secure eventually the enduring protection of wilderness. But that Wilderness Walks program is phenomenal. It began as a hiking group, and it's matured into what it is today, a leading statewide wilderness organization across the country.
Finally, with Sally thanking everybody, we should maybe note that these Northern Rockies are the place for the final struggle in designating wilderness. And Montana, not necessarily to our credit, but Montana is the final state to have to complete its wilderness inventory for whatever our Congress people and the Congress decides. I think the struggle being here and just before us in Idaho was inevitable. These 27 million acres of public estate in Idaho and Montana, lying in the high plains and the peaks and valleys and ramps of the Rocky Mountains, are America's Gettysburg, environmental Gettysburg. Because we see pitted here the two great passions in the West. Conservation on the one hand, and jobs almost at any cost on the other. And it's here at this 50th anniversary, well located in America's environmental Gettysburg. The panel is very grateful for you being here tonight.
We're very grateful for the panel. I can't think of a better panel to kick off this particular conference. So thank you all so much, and thank you all for coming.
Good to see you. It's been a while.